Well, let's try to get some insights from Jeffrey Garrett, Chief Executive at U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney, and joining us from our Sydney studios. Thank you so much for dropping in. Around this time every year, we do tend to have a bit of a tit-for-tat situation coming out between Washington and Beijing. But this year, it seems like tensions have notched up a bit higher. What do you think? What do you make of the situation that's happening right now?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that the tensions are higher than they've been in recent years, probably for two reasons. The first one is that unlike most of the currency negotiations in earlier this decade, American unemployment is now at 10% rather than 5%, so the pressure on Congress and the Obama administration to get tough with China is higher than it's been before. And then, of course, after a 2005-2008 period in which the RMB appreciated gradually by about 20% against the dollar, it's been flat essentially since the Lehman crash. So Americans look at a dollar in free fall against other major currencies, but rock solid against the RMB, against the backdrop of 10% unemployment, with an American trade deficit that went down last year, but where its deficit with China went down less, and they say, boy, China's the problem.
Why do you think that the United States is resorting to what appears to be the strategy of the stick rather than the carrot? Because time and time again, how many times do you see the U.S. getting the upper hand when you try to go tough on China? What's going to happen if they decide to build China a currency manipulator? I mean, look at what's happening with Google. I mean, what do you have to gain by taking a hardline approach?
Well, I think it would be premature to say that the U.S. is going to use the stick against China. What we've seen in the past is that Congress can make a lot of loud noises about getting tough with China, but typically it's the executive branch and the president where cooler heads prevail. Lindsey Graham and Chuck Schumer have had a bill in the past. I think they introduced the bill in 2005 to slap some big tariffs on China. Ultimately, that's not what happened, and softly, behind closed doors, negotiation between the Bush administration and the Chinese government led to a gradual appreciation of the RMB, as I said, 20% between 2005 and 2008. I would actually still bet that that's what will happen this time, that the Treasury won't label China a currency manipulator and will go for the behind closed doors negotiation. But the pressure coming out of Congress is obviously more intense than it was a few years ago, and Americans on the left think that they've now got their president, Barack Obama, in the White House. So there will be more pressure for Obama to resist, but I'd still expect the Obama administration to resist that pressure and not take what could be the very incendiary step of labeling China formally a currency manipulator.
Yeah, I think this is exactly it, Jeffrey. Patricia Savas talking from London, that in the long run you always have to keep a long-term perspective, and mouthing off right now could really long-term possibly damage a very important trading partner, not only to the US but to the rest of the globe. So in terms of a revaluation of the currency of the yuan, when do you think actually that could restart? As you were saying, it is literally flat since Lehman collapsed. What would it take right now, do you think, for the Chinese to really start coming around?
Well, I'd be somewhere between expecting and hoping that the process would look more or less as it did from the middle of 2005. That is, that there would be a private agreement between the Chinese and Americans that the Chinese government would allow the RMB gradually to appreciate. The first move would be by the Chinese, and it would be, only a few percentage points, but over time there'd be a gradual appreciation, understanding that the Chinese government just doesn't want massive shocks to the system, either domestically or internationally. So I think it would probably be good for the world economy if something like the 2005-2008 appreciation happened where it was done in a more or less consensual way. I think you're absolutely right that the global trading system is the big story here. And if I was looking at underappreciated or undertold elements of the US-China story, I'd be thinking about companies like Apple and General Motors. So yes, there are a lot of iPods assembled in China, but the value added and the profits all return to the US. Then take a look at a car company like GM. Last year it sold more cars in China than it did in the US. The problem from a political standpoint is those cars were made in China rather than in Detroit. But again, the profits helped prop up GM, a company that's in big trouble. So that's the new trading world.
Well, one thing that I find interesting in your notes is that you think that Chinese currency is actually overvalued, and also you think that maybe it is in their domestic interest to let it rise in the order of even up to 20% in years. How is this possible?
No, I think, I'm sorry, I misspoke in my notes, which I was typing very quickly. I think it is undervalued, but one thing that I'm certainly picking up in China in the last 6 months is a view that the Chinese are just so much more confident after the financial crisis than they were before, and their reference are more domestic ones than international ones. So the Chinese government understands that it's got to somehow cool down the Chinese economy in a gradual way to reduce the bubbles that we think are in the Chinese economy. So withdrawing fiscal stimulus, tightening bank lending would be important elements of that, but allowing the RMB gradually to appreciate would be as well. So I guess the big point for me there would be that China is thinking much more post-global financial crisis about domestic conditions and less about how the international arena and Americans are thinking about their economy.
Right, but of course the Chinese argument is that a lot of factories in the South are still trading on, margins of 2 to 3%, so that it's difficult. Well, we appreciate your time and thoughts today. Plenty for us to debate next time as well. Jeffrey Garrett, Chief Executive at U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney. And let's find out what happened on Wall Street overnight with Patricia.